I normally safeguarding adult reviews. They're often referred to as SARS, and that's how I'll talk about it from now on. They are a statutory process, and they're normally commissioned from an independent person like me, who investigates the circumstances around normally the death, sadly, of an adult, and it's normally an adult who had care and support needs. And the purpose of the review is to really understand what happened for the individual and whether anything could have been done differently or better, possibly to prevent the death, but generally to improve practice in the future. So this safeguarding review looks specifically at the topic of intergenerational trauma. Now, it's quite a complex topic, I'll say that to begin with, and it builds very much on the wider evidence base around trauma. Now, I know that Manchester City Council and Manchester Safeguarding Partnership are really keen to move towards more trauma-informed practice. So many of you will already know something about this, but just to recap, so trauma is an emotional or a psychological experience. It's not about a physical trauma or a kind of a medical situation. And it's normally an experience that's been deeply disturbing or distressing to the individual. Different ways of referring to it are adverse experiences, and often we talk about childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. And all of those terms are normally referring to this sort of emotional distress caused by an event or a series of events in someone's life. So intergenerational trauma builds on that idea, but it's looking specifically at the trauma that can be transmitted between family members. So that's normally between a parent and a child, or parents and children, but it could also be wider family members. So it could be grandparents or aunts and uncles, like a wider family circle. And if it involves wider family members, it's often called transgenerational trauma. So to me, the topic of intergenerational trauma is perfectly relates to looking at families, because it's talking about the transmission, the interchange and the effect of trauma that's happened in one generation and how that can affect future generations. So obviously that's very much looking at the family as a whole and trying to understand what's going on for the family as a whole and not just focusing on one individual. Probably the most important factor to understand in relation to the concept of intergenerational trauma is that the child isn't exposed to the original traumatic event. But what the child is exposed to is the parent's response to that traumatic event. So that might be in the parent's behaviour, it might be in the way they parent, it might be in their emotional responses or their ability to cope. And it could be a whole different range of things. But the central idea, and it's probably quite an unusual one, is that the child isn't exposed to the trauma, the original event itself, but they are experiencing the parent's reaction to it. So the most common example, and actually where the research around intergenerational trauma originated, is sadly from the experience of Holocaust survivors, where it became obvious that children of Holocaust survivors were also experiencing some emotional response based on their own parents' experience. So that's the classic example where the research originated actually about intergenerational trauma. But there are other examples. So, for example, if you are the child of a refugee or an asylum seeker, if you are the child of a veteran, someone who's been involved in war situations. It might also be if you've fled a country, or your parents have fled a country due to persecution. So there's a wide range of examples where there is a risk, I suppose, or an increased risk of trauma being transmitted from parent to child. But I think what I would say, and what I've noticed about these groups, is that they're normally social groups. It might be orientated around faith or similar experiences. And many of these groups, I would suggest, are probably on the fringes of society and maybe marginalised by society in one way or another. And I think that's a particularly important angle to think about, because that might actually be, they may actually be vulnerable because of being marginalised as well. So there seems to be a bit of a pattern, I think, in terms of traditionally the groups of people and their experiences that are linked with intergenerational trauma. So the first thing to say in response to that is that, and be really transparent about this, is that when you look at this topic, there isn't a lot of research which focuses specifically on adult social care and the adult social care world, or for that matter on safeguarding. So what we've done with this review is we've tried to understand intergenerational trauma in a much broader way and how that might apply in safeguarding scenarios. But I'm sure if you're listening to this and you're a practitioner, I'm absolutely sure that many of you will have worked with families where you've observed that there is a repeat pattern of behaviour, which is of concern to you and which may have safeguarding implications. Not always, but if you observe that in practice, that's partly why we're flagging this, because if you see that pattern across families that you work with, that's something to think about and bear in mind in your practice. The research from the review, and then also I think looking at the SARS from other areas, they definitely point towards certain types of parental behaviour or experience being linked to the transmission of trauma to other family members, particularly parent to child. So there seems to be a pattern around substance misuse and dependency in relation to self-harm and death by suicide, and also around domestic abuse and violence. And bear in mind that that broad definition of domestic abuse and violence also includes psychological, aspects of domestic abuse and coercive control and things like that. Yeah, I think what the evidence seems to suggest, particularly the formal research evidence, is that the transmission of traumatic experience between families can be influenced by both genetics, so our genes, our biology, if you like, but also by our environmental factors, so our upbringing, our family circumstances, and therefore our lived experience. So it's kind of the nature-nurture debate, really. But I think it's really, really important to say at this point that none of us should assume that because there is a family history of something, and there could be some genetic underpinning to that, none of us should assume that it's inevitable. So I think it's really important as practitioners not to make assumptions and to actually work with families in a very non-judgmental way, and in a way which doesn't predict what might happen next. It would seem that the research suggests that there could be, but I think it's not just the genetic inheritance. It's also a combination of genetics, so our biology, our genes, combined with our lived experience and the environmental factors, including the way we're brought up. So from a practice point of view and from a safeguarding point of view, I think the message is we shouldn't make assumptions, and that isn't a message I'm not giving a message which says actually we are beholden to our genes and certain ways of behaving become inevitable. I think it's just simply about recognising that if there is a pattern within families of certain behaviours, then there is a potential risk, an increased risk, that other family members will be affected by those issues. And in particular, they would appear to be substance dependency and when there's been a death by suicide in a family. So I think on that basis, the one really important message for practice and for practitioners is to be really acutely aware of supporting wider family members, particularly when there's been a death by suicide, and what that might look like, and whether that involves safeguarding general practice, risk management practice, wider safeguarding practice, and might even include safety planning and crisis planning. Yeah, there were. And I think this adds to the bigger picture, actually, because there are other vulnerabilities or additional needs that may also contribute to kind of care and safeguarding needs when it comes to this topic of family trauma. So what I found was that there were 4 additional issues that seemed to be associated with the safeguarding adult reviews that were used to inform this particular review for Manchester. So the first one was having a diagnosed mental health condition or consistently poor mental health. Having a learning disability or learning difficulty was the second one. Having experience of the care system as a young person, so being care experienced. And then lastly, and I think one that chimed generally with some of the findings from Manchester Safeguarding Reviews, was as a parent, having a child or children removed from your care also seemed to be an additional risk factor. Yeah, so when you do a SAR like this, which is more research based, you're always looking for really kind of key messages that can help practitioners to use this information productively in your day-to-day working lives. So I think the first thing to say, and to maybe provide some reassurance about actually, is that there does seem to be evidence, good evidence from both safeguarding adult reviews elsewhere and also from formal academic research that the trauma experienced by a parent can be transmitted to their child or their children without the children being directly exposed to that trauma or to that really difficult experience. So that's the first message to take away. So if you see patterns of trauma within a family, you're probably not imagining it. It is something that is a real thing that can happen. So the second piece of learning, which many of you again will be very familiar with from your training and professional backgrounds, is really the key to avoiding trauma, is to really promote and support healthy and well-functioning parent-child relationships. So really focusing on the relational aspects of family dynamics, and you as a professional supporting those, because what the evidence would seem to suggest is that it's not inevitable that trauma is transmitted and transferred to children. And actually, really good parenting can disrupt that transmission and avoid young people and children being exposed to more or new trauma. So, there's a really strong message there around the value of really good parenting and good interpersonal, interfamily relations. So you won't be surprised to hear me say this, but professional curiosity is really, really important in safeguarding work. And that need, that desire, that curiosity to understand family history, it's really relevant. And the evidence from this review suggests it's even more relevant, because actually we know that some of those issues can exist within families and can be transmitted to children. So in terms of your work with families, really work to develop a relationship of trust with parents so that you can get to know them and get to know some of their experiences as well. So I think continuing from that, the other key bit of learning is about having a family mindset in practice. Because I think probably in both adult services and in children's services, the tendency and the legislation tends to lead you to look at one individual in isolation. So this is more kind of evidence, if you like, that having a family-focused approach is really important and really valuable, and looking at the family circumstances holistically, particularly when there are certain issues that are present within the family. And just to recap on those, so they are substance dependency, suicide, but also sustained self-harm or suicidal ideation by family members, where there's domestic abuse, including adults who are part of the MARAC process, and particularly as well parents who have had children removed from their care. And then I think lastly, the final point to bear in mind in practice situations is that there's really, I think, quite strong evidence around supporting family members who have been bereaved as a result of suicide, and offering kind of a therapeutic support, referring into bereavement support, which there is a good offer in Greater Manchester. It feels like that's a really, really important practical step that practitioners could take to ensure support the wider family members.